Hello, Bible readers. Chapters 15 and 16 today. These are a unit, together telling about the 7 plagues, again, one last time, which, again, still the same 7 plagues, just from a different perspective. One different thing about the plagues from this angle. When 16:17 says, "It is done," it really is done. This is it. We won't have to rewind and see these plagues again from a 4th perspective or anything like that. The end of history is upon us, and the eschaton, that is the end of the world, is upon us. Professor Boring says the extremely violent pictures are interpreted as an Exodus scene where biblical memory is transfigured, and as a liturgical scene where Christian worship is transfigured. So this first chapter we're looking at today, chapter 15, has a transfiguration of 2 very familiar things. The Exodus scene from the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, and Christian worship itself. So if you're familiar with the transfiguration of Jesus and that story, then maybe this is a helpful way of accessing this chapter of the vision. When Jesus gets transfigured in the Gospels, he and some choice disciples are on a mountaintop, and Jesus' clothes become bright white, and he is revealed as divine. That's the first thing. But the second thing in a transfiguration is that there is a divine summons, a command to listen to him from God. So that too is using the Exodus story, using worship as what would be familiar to them to say, here's what's divine, and listen. So a transfiguration is where God takes something, at least a little familiar, and uses it to communicate divinity or holiness and elicit obedience from, in this case, the 7 churches in Asia. First, God transfigures the Exodus scene. John sees a sea of glass mixed with fire. Of course, the Red Sea is an important image in biblical memory, and that's what this is drawing on. If you know the story of Israel, you can see in your mind's eye Israel on the banks of the Red Sea, looking back over what just happened, celebrating God's work to set them free from slavery in Egypt. This sea of glass mixed with fire. Maybe we can imagine the church standing at its shores, seeing what victory God has made after the end of all things, singing the song of Moses and the song of the Lamb. The Exodus story is used by John as a model for what God is up to in the end, freeing the church from the Egypt of his own day, which is Rome. Pharaoh is now Caesar. The plagues are now called woes. Seas and rivers become blood, like they do in Exodus. We read of, in Revelation, we'll read of darkness and waters drying up and the smoke of Sinai. These are all familiar images from Exodus, transfigured in John's usage. And notice that as at the Red Sea, there's just 2 groups here in Revelation pictured in this section: those with the mark of the beast and those who have conquered. There is no nuance. It is entirely winners and losers, us and them language, which the reason Boring wants to really point that out, it's what leads Boring to say this means that the description of the terrors is presented as a confession of praise for what happens to us, not a description of what happens to them. This us and them language, it shows Revelation is for the us in that equation. So the Exodus story gets transfigured. I want to move on to the 7 bowls of God's wrath. Like the 7 trumpets, these bowls provide a glimpse of judgment that's even more intense than the last perspective. Not merely a third or a fourth of the world gets struck, but all the world gets struck in these bowls. Everything in the sea dies. Not just the earth, but the cosmos itself is struck. Human rebellion against God has infected the creation itself. And so John's claiming that if creation is to be redeemed, it too, like the whole creation, is going to have to pass through judgment. In chapter 16, verse 5, the angel of the waters says, "You are just, O Holy One." John wants to make the point that nothing that's happening here is not deserved. This is not God being emotional or vengeful. God is here being just. In chapter 16, verse 12, the sixth angel's bowl dries up the river Euphrates, and kings from the east pour in. This again is a reference to the Parthians. John pushes that button a number of times in Revelation, and then we see that evil trinity pop up again, the dragon and the beasts, only this time they're being used by God for the last battle at a place called Harmagedon. And so now we've come to the point where I need to say a little bit more about this battle of the word we oftentimes hear used as Armageddon. So in my Bible, it starts with an H. And as I was reading through it, I'm like, so is that the same as, why is there an H on it? Boring says, popular uncritical interpretations of Revelation have often supposed that Revelation predicts some great battle at Megiddo, a place in northern Israel, as part of the final events of history. These events are wrong, he says. I love when biblical scholars are certain. That John is writing prophecy does not mean John is predicting historical events in the long-range future. He's presenting an inspired interpretation of contemporary events for the Christians of his own time. John is not predicting any historical event beyond his own time. In fact, no battle gets described. John uses traditional military imagery, but in his theology, the decisive victory was already won by Jesus on the cross, and when he didn't stay dead. That's convincing to me. That's what the rest of the letter has been like. So it could be that the Har of Harmagedon refers to a mountain, because in Hebrew, Har means mountain. So the mountain of Magedon, the problem with that is that's not a place that anybody knows of. And lots of study has gone into this part of the world, so we would know if there was a place called Harmagedon, mountain. So we know by now that John likes to play with words. So what might he be doing here? There is a place called Megiddo in northern Israel where some important battles happened, but there's no mountain. The nearest mountain is Mount Carmel, where Elijah defeated the prophets of Baal. Could John be hoping his readers would connect all those dots as though he was saying that the church stands in the tradition of Elijah, who fought off the idolatrous prophets of Baal, just like we in our time have to fight off the godless Romans? Maybe? Boring says another possibility is that a slight adjustment in spelling could take us to the word Magedon, which means assembly, which would mean mountain of assembly. Well, in chapter 16, verse 14, he even uses that word assembling. He says all the baddies are being assembled. And there was a mount of assembly. And actually that mount of assembly was spoken of in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 to 15. And that section was talking about the king of Babylon in mythological terms. So this could be a way to get at some of those images in the Old Testament. Bottom line about Armageddon is this. John, like usual, is trying to evoke images from the Old Testament and then reshape them for his own message. And even if we can't for certain know which images he was trying to evoke, we do know he was not trying to encode a place or a time of some future last day battle when and where the world would end, which is how popular culture talks about Armageddon, right? That is not what Revelation is for. It's just not how John writes or why John is writing. Last thing, in chapter 16, verse 15, when Christ himself speaks, he reinforces this idea about what John is trying to do. John is reminding his churches that Jesus himself is challenging them to orient their lives in the present toward God, toward what is real, away from what is false. Okay, so in my next post, we're going to look at the fall of Babylon, Rome, and the lament, chapters 17 and 18. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.